Hello and welcome to Unbelievable. I'm John Nelson and today we're joined by Jeremy Boring, media entrepreneur, producer and co-founder of the Daily Wire, one of the most influential conservative media companies in the United States. Jeremy has spoken openly about culture, power, politics and faith, and today we're going to explore not just the headlines, but the deeper story underneath them. What happens when a society becomes post-Christian? How media shapes our sense of reality, and the role of America in a rapidly changing world. Jeremy, thanks for joining us.
This is the best thing I've ever done.
I didn't tell him to say that. You've helped build one of the most influential conservative media companies of the last decade. When you were a child, did you ever imagine working in a space like this?
No, certainly not. I grew up doing theater and music poorly, and had the ambition to go west and try my hand in L.A. In no part of my mind had I ever considered being involved in politics or political media. But, moving to L.A. really did help shape my politics. I had the values that I had from growing up in West Texas, which were, conservative by the standards of L.A. They probably weren't conservative by the standards of West Texas. But I didn't know that L.A. would be hostile to my values. I didn't know that Hollywood as an industry would be largely hostile to my values until I got there. And even when I got there, I was pretty naive about the whole thing. So I didn't have the good sense to hide any of my sort of political leanings, nascent as they were. And one thing that I love about L.A. is that it demands so much of you. I suspect London may be the same. Maybe it's all big cities, but a big city is constantly trying to kill you, It's trying to defeat you, and to make your way, you have to be at war with it sort of all the time. And I began to see my Christianity and my political values as just part of that battle against the city, this battle not to be swallowed up by the sort of prevailing culture of the city, not to be washed away by it. And I think that living in a place where your values are sort of out of fashion forces you to examine them. It forces you, and I'd never, to the extent I had values, I hadn't deeply examined them by any means. And so I kind of credit Hollywood in a unique way with shaping my values. And after the first decade of being there, I'd become quite politically involved. And I became a part of an organization called Friends of Abe, which was a secret, not so secret organization of Hollywood professionals who had conservative leaning values. And we would meet in secret. We would have sort of initiation meetings. It was almost like Alcoholics are Anonymous. You'd have to confess that you were a conservative at the beginning. Hi, I'm Jeremy. And that was an incredible experience too, because I met so many people, grown adults, working at the highest levels of the industry and every level in the industry who, their agents didn't know their politics or their co-workers didn't know their politics. In one case, a man said his wife, as he introduced himself to the group, as if my wife knew I was here, she might divorce me. And it was really that experience that made me realize, I'd been cavalier about all of this for my first decade in town, but there were real consequences for people for having the values that had been really solidified in me in that first decade. And so I think that's when I really joined the fight in earnest.
So was it with a kind of battle mindset that you helped to create the Daily Wire? I mean, what was it trying to be? Was it just another media organization? Was it a movement, a kind of countercultural institution, perhaps?
Well, there were two things really at play. One of them is that I had 5 years earlier come to know Ben Shapiro and saw in Ben Shapiro, I think everyone who's ever met Ben Shapiro as a young man saw potential in him. But I don't think many people saw potential in media, like as a talk host. I mean, Ben had, in his very early years, real musical talent and, of course, an unbelievable intellect. And everyone knew that he would go far. I knew he could go far in media, which I think was less obvious. Ben's very fast talking. In those days, particularly, was somewhat socially awkward. But I knew that he had chops. I mean, I'm my life has had prepared me to see that kind of talent in people. And I set about to sort of help Ben find his way. He was already pursuing talk radio passionately. He had joined an organization called Talk Radio Network founded by Mark Masters, which at the time was the largest private talk radio syndicator in the country. And Ben had joined them as their corporate counsel on the condition that they would also teach him about radio. And he had a weekend radio show, which he did from his bedroom in a townhouse in L.A., but which aired on Saturdays in Orlando, Florida. And so, Ben was he was after it. He was chasing it. Because of my position within Friends of Abe, a lot of the board members of an organization called the David Horowitz Freedom Center had become my acquaintances. And I believe that that Ben's best destiny would be to become the successor to David Horowitz. And David famously said of his organization, we're not a think tank, we're a battle tank. So you ask if it was with sort of a battle mentality. Absolutely. David, like Ben, very intellectual. David, like Ben, a fighter. David, like Ben, Jewish. Many differences. David grew up as a red diaper baby. His Judaism was much more ethnic than religious, unlike Ben, for whom Judaism is important in both aspects. But nevertheless, I saw Ben as a real successor, and I began planting seeds with various board members. And over time, those seeds bore some fruit. And David asked Ben to join, and Ben brought me along, and we created an organization called Truth Revolt, which was really the precursor to the Daily Wire. But I was quickly disenchanted with the nonprofit mechanism. I've said before that it's always been interesting to me that in America, I don't know if it's the same over here, but conservatives, while purporting to believe in the efficiencies of the market and the power of the profit modem as an incentive, almost completely rely on nonprofit organizations to promulgate their worldview. Meanwhile, the left, which purports to hate the market and to hate the profit motive, almost exclusively uses for-profit mechanisms to promulgate their worldview, which by our standards means they're going to win. They've chosen the more efficient mechanism. And so I began to see a path with this sort of emerging social media environment around us where we might be able to take the same sort of work we were doing for David Horowitz and do it in a more for-profit way. And we started by pitching that to the Freedom Center as a possible pivot that they could make with our project. They didn't see the vision at the time. There's a very funny story that Ben and I were at a board meeting for the Horowitz Freedom Center, and I was trying to explain to them why if they would make this particular investment and let us operate in a sort of for-profit capacity, it would only have to be a one-time investment, that I thought the mechanisms existed that would allow us to cash flow out of a one-time investment and grow completely out of cash flow. No matter how many times I explained it, no one got it. Well, of course, these people are all very high IQ individuals. I mean, the Freedom Centers doesn't attract slouches. And at that time, Ben would refer to me as the stupid whisperer because unlike anybody else in his life, I wasn't a 160 IQ guy, so I could help translate him to the hoi polloi. But even the stupid whisperer could not help the board of the Horowitz Freedom Center understand this concept. And so Ben turned over a sheet of paper and he drew a $sign with an arrow, a computer with an arrow, an F for Facebook, and an arrow back to the $sign. They said, "This is our business model." And they promptly fired me. They didn't fire him. It was his. Anyway.
So
we from there quickly went off and along with Caleb Robinson formed the Daily Wire.
So the Daily Wire is an independent media organization,
yes,
though sometimes it doesn't feel like it because it's just become so big.
Right.
What do you think legacy media was missing about your audience?
Well, I think they were missing our audience entirely. If you go back 10 years, 2015, you're in the waning days of the Barack Obama presidency in the States, and the left was operating from a place of pure hubris. They believed that they would never lose another election. Hillary Clinton was the obvious successor to Barack Obama. They were using language like this, end of history kind of language, will never lose another election. And from that place of hubris, they had really alienated a huge portion of the American public. America's, generally speaking, a fairly evenly divided nation politically and remains so decade after decade. I mean, it's a unique feature of our country, I think, in our sort of polarity between the two parties, that each party is competing for maximum market share which means necessarily that they're always both going to represent about half the country. And so they had just assumed that one half of the country would never be able to attain meaningful power within our national politics anymore, and they started to act like it. They started to talk like it. And when you do that, you create a lot of back pressure. And so by the time the Daily Wire came along, there was an incredible appetite in the country to support that sort of alternative voice. Because it isn't it was not a fringe alternative. It was a very mainstream alternative. I don't mean mainstream in the sort of political parlance. I mean it as a matter of fact. 50% of the country broadly agreed with the things that we represented and weren't being represented by the legacy media. So in some ways, it was the kind of market efficiency that you could drive a truck through. Market it, yeah.
I think we in the UK have a tendency to see American media as very polarized. I wonder what was the Daily Wire doing that, say, Fox News wasn't doing? What was the niche that it was filling?
Well, I would say at that time, Fox News was not a successful digital media operation at all. They were the most successful terrestrial operation. But there was a huge opportunity in digital media, and that's the one that Daily Wire moved to fill. It wasn't so much that our politics were decidedly different than Fox, although they were. Fox at that time in particular really appealed to baby boomers, and we endeavored to appeal to Gen X and millennials. But mostly, I think, yes, it was the Gen X and millennial sensibility on the one hand, but more importantly, it really was the medium.
I wonder what role you see the media as having in shaping our beliefs, because I often think of a phrase that Charles Taylor uses, which is the social imaginary, because we tend to think of ourselves as sort of rational thinking beings. But actually what Charles Taylor is saying with that social imaginary is the imaginary is the cultural narratives, the symbols, the art that are actually sort of subconsciously informing our beliefs. So where does the media fit into that?
They play an enormous role. I often say that we're fish in water, and, for better and for worse, we are products of our environment. There have been studies that have demonstrated that people will behave consistent with perceived social norms, even if it's in contravention with their most deeply held beliefs. So the culture drives the majority of our behavior. And I would even say it probably goes much further. The culture ultimately drives the majority of our deeply held beliefs. But when there's discrepancy between the two, we go culture every time. Even the window within which our beliefs exist is largely shaped by culture. We all like to think, that if we lived in the if we lived in the 1930s, we would have hidden Anne Frank in our attic, and if we'd lived in the 1830s, we would have worked in the Underground Railroad to free the slaves in America, and all the way back. And I think it's nice that we think that, because it actually shows that we aspire to good.
Sure.
But it's probably not true. I mean, as a matter of fact, the majority of people did not do those things. And that's because of the power of culture. I think that media, as Andrew Breitbart famously said, a mentor of mine, politics is downstream of culture. And of course, it's not as simple as politics being downstream of culture. Politics, the whole thing is a bit of a continuum, but it is certainly true that politics exist within a cultural framework. I think the most obvious example of it in our history is that when Barack Obama won the presidency in 2008, it would not have been possible as a Democrat to ascend to the presidency in support of gay marriage. When Barack Obama won re-election in 2012, it would not have been possible as a Democrat to ascend the presidency without supporting gay marriage. And in 2016, it would not have been possible for Donald Trump as a Republican to ascend the presidency without supporting gay marriage. That's the most radical movement in public opinion on a massive moral issue, I believe, in all of human history. And it was largely driven by an NBC sitcom called Will and Grace.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, NBC put a show in prime time about a very funny gay man and his very funny gay friend. And because of the power of, especially at that time, before the atomization of media in the digital media age, that was sort of the very waning days of the sort of hegemonic power of broadcast television. That means that millions upon millions upon millions of people invited gay friends into their home, in places where most people had never met an openly gay person. Rural America, people invited their gay friends now into their living room, and the show was amazingly well written, amazingly well acted. It was terrific on the merits of being a very funny sitcom. And it completely changed how people felt about that issue because two of their best friends who they spent time with every evening in syndication now were gay. That's so powerful that within an 8-year span, Democrats, the left had to oppose gay marriage, the left embraced gay marriage, and enough of the right embraced gay marriage that it became critical.
So on the influence of media, you've sometimes been referred to jokingly as the God King, the Daily Wire, the lowercase god, one of the Roman deities.
Yes. The lesser Roman deity.
I wonder what you make of that. And, did running something, on a more serious note, did running something sort of so powerful ever tempt you towards thinking that you could in some way control the narrative?
Well, sure. So I've often been referred to by my opponents as the self-proclaimed God King. But of course, I didn't proclaim myself the God King. Andrew Klavan proclaimed me the God King. Thank you very much. And I think that if anyone has seen, for example, the razor commercial that launched Jeremy's Razors and does not understand from that how tongue-in-cheek and self-deprecating the whole thing is, then, well, I don't know what they think about reality, but certainly being the CEO of a company like the Daily Wire comes with many temptations. Moses didn't get to inherit the promised land, and David didn't get to build the temple, and being used by God doesn't mean being rewarded by God. One of the things that I say often is God has a funny way of recommending himself and not recommending us. So yes, certainly temptation, a belief that we could change the narrative. I wouldn't say control. I mean, we've always been an opposition movement. We've always known that we were a minority movement in terms of perhaps not electorally, but certainly a minority movement culturally. And so that sort of bunker mentality keeps you from having delusions that are too great. But power, of course, is accompanied by some delusions and some pride. The three most corrosive elements on earth are power, fame, and wealth. And our success at the Daily Wire afforded us a measure of all three. So no question, there are temptations that accompany that sort of a rise.
I wonder if one of the temptations is towards a kind of rage-driven algorithm, that there is the possibility that if you put out content which is, I think the term is rage bait, that you're going to feed the algorithm. Do you think that's ever been a temptation with the Daily Wire?
Well, of course, the Daily Wire is an independent brand, meaning independent of its hosts. The hosts have independent brands, independent of Daily Wire and independent of each other. But the Daily Wire also, its brand can't help but be impacted by the brand of its hosts, and probably vice versa. So it's a fairly complicated series of brand considerations when you talk about, was the Daily Wire tempted by, that's very broad. Yeah. What I would say is, of course, there is a temptation to pursue money, clicks, affirmation. Those are occupational hazards when one performs in the public sphere. I think the Daily Wire did an above-average job of resisting those temptations. There's what I call the grift industrial complex on the right. Just as Eisenhower suggested we must beware the military industrial complex, I would say we must beware the grift industrial complex. But as much as Daily Wire has been accused of being grifters by our adversaries online, that's simply not true. I think we did a very above average job of resisting those temptations. And the reason is we had our priorities rightly ordered. I would not say that we never had misordered priorities. Of course, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But we sort of understood early on what our mission was. And our mission, while empowered by the profit motive, profit was not our mission. Yeah. And so I think we did a fairly good job of not being rage baiters the majority of the time. I think one way you can evidence this is just to say, I would say, on what major issues have Ben and I changed our minds over time. The answer isn't none, but the answer is fairly small. We were well-formed politically and philosophically when we started, and when those ideas have been in vogue and when they have been out of vogue, we've been consistent advocates for them.
I wonder what are some of those ideas where you've felt yourself shift personally?
We're moving toward, or rather, there is an ascendant illiberalism on the American right, and I think indeed on the global right. I thought in 2016 that if we ascended Donald Trump as the nominee of the Republican Party, American conservatism would begin to look more like European conservatism. And American conservatism has always been quite distinct from European conservatism. For one thing, it's sort of definitionally true that European conservatism seeks to conserve monarchy or seeks to conserve the power of the institutional church. Yeah. America's never had monarchy or an institutional church. So our conservatism did not seek to conserve those things. Conservatives weren't the king's men. American conservatives, I've come under a lot of fire for saying this over the years by a few folks who will remain nameless. But I say that American conservatism in many ways exists to conserve American liberalism. But just like American conservatism is not European conservatism, American liberalism isn't European liberalism. American liberalism in the way that I mean the term is not meant to be conflated with American leftism. American liberalism is sort of creedal American ideas. All men are created equal, equality under the law, lowercase r republicanism, democratic systems, but Republican forms of government, human freedom, freedom of speech, the right, the Bill of Rights, broadly speaking. So I think American conservatism has always existed to conserve creedal Americanism, might be a less controversial way to say it, which makes American conservatism unique. The ascendant sort of illiberalism on the American right is therefore a real departure from American conservatism historically speaking, because it either rejects outright or at least challenges the idea that America is in any way a creedal nation. Of course, America isn't only a creedal nation, but America is somewhat uniquely a creedal nation in addition to being a place and a people. It's a place and a people and a governing philosophy and a set of ideas. It's both. And so, I would say that I have become a less libertarian. I've never been a libertarian like a Libertarian Party man, but I've become less libertarian in my politics as we've sort of observed the excesses of the last 40 years of politics in the West. But only just. I don't blame lowercase l liberalism for the failures of our country. I blame us for the failures of our country. Liberalism is an idea. It's a tool, like capitalism is a tool. It's a very good tool, just like capitalism is a very good tool, when it's channeled and constrained by virtue. And if the people stop having virtue, then liberalism becomes liberalism is still a very powerful tool. It's just no longer a very powerful tool in service of good. Capitalism is still a very powerful tool, but not in service always of good. And so I don't blame the ism. One of the things I've said a few times recently is that, and in fairness, I think that Alexander Berkman came up with this idea back in the early 20th century. He wrote a fascinating little book called The ABCs of Anarcho-Communism. And he talked about all the different left-wing philosophies. And some of them were not things that, as an American in the latter days of the 20th century, they weren't sort of schools of thought that I knew were distinct. But he was drawing a real distinction between, socialism and communism and democratic socialism and libertarianism, which he included as a left-wing philosophy, which got my attention when I was in my early 20s and read his book. And as he sort of talked about the subtle distinctions between them all, I realized, they're all trying to solve an original sin. They've all defined an original sin, none of which are original sin. Communists define original sin as class, wealth inequality, and the libertarians define it as coercion from government. I say original sin is just original sin. And I think part of what's unique about America is that the founders of our country understood that actual original sin couldn't be solved by any sort of ism. And so they created a government that, again, sought to mitigate the downsides of original sin by bifurcating or power across sundry branches of government, or by ensuring that power couldn't consolidate itself in one person, that government would be representative. They built all of those systems in because they knew that original sin would persist. And I think that a lot of people now who want to have an illiberal order in America or in the West, I think that they've just created a new original sin, which they believe is liberalism. And I think, well, if we could undo liberalism, we'd have the good old days back. But we wouldn't. We would just have the other days back when the actual original sin was still very much at work in the world. And if instead of trying to undo the arbitrary original sin of liberalism, we actually just focused on the impacts of true original sin in the world, well, then we could still have the world that we had 50 years ago, which was a pretty good place. Liberalism was a well-channeled, capitalism was a well-channeled tool for human flourishing in the hands of virtuous people. So that's where I believe our focus should be.
Well, Jeremy, there's so much more to discuss, but we do need to take a short break. If you want more interviews like this, follow us on social media. That's at UnbelievableFE on X and at Premier Unbelievable on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube if you're watching rather than just listening. And if you're enjoying the show, do leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back in just a moment.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online, so thanks again.
Jeremy, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
You recently stepped down as co-CEO of the Daily Wire. I wondered why now and what is next for you? What sort of projects are you working on at the moment?
Ben and I have been collaborators for almost 15 years. And Ben, Caleb, and I founded the Daily Wire over 10 years ago now. 10 years is a long time to keep a band together. We had a lot of hits. I'm proud of the work that we did. Over time, though, our priorities began to shift and in some places diverge, and it became time to go work on solo albums. I've just finished my last major obligation to the Daily Wire. I'll still be available to them as a consultant and still own a very small equity piece in the company. But my last real commitment to the company was the Pendragon Cycle, which is the most ambitious project that the Daily Wire has ever taken on. In my 10 years of leadership at the company, we started off with a $4.7 million investment. And over 10 years, we did over $1 billion in revenue.
Wow.
In our last couple of years, we had over $200 million of annual revenue. And so we deployed $1 billion into the fight for our values together. And it was always a part of our ambition for the company to not only criticize culture, but to create it. And in 2001, we released our first feature film, Dallas Saulnier's Run, Hide, Fight. We brought Dallas on to help us produce additional movies. We made Terror on the Prairie with Gina Carano and Shut In with Rainey Qualley. And we got involved in kids entertainment with the launch of our Bentkey app and made A Wonderful Day with Mabel McClay and Gus Plus Us and Chip Chilla, our first kids cartoon. So we've been hard at work making cultural content, which was, again, always part of our mission. We're all Hollywood guys, right? I mean, the Daily Wire started in L.A., Ben was a screenwriter. I was a screenwriter. Andrew Klavan was a successful screenwriter, something that neither Ben nor I could claim. So that whole original Daily Wire crew, we're all people with film backgrounds. But the Daily Wire is sort of the culmination of at least my tenure of the Daily Wire, the culmination of our cultural efforts. It's an enormous undertaking. 1,000 people, 1,000 different artists and craftsmen worked on the show. It's 7 episodes in excess of 1 hour each. It's based on the unbelievable work of Stephen R. Lawhead, who wrote these novels called The Pendragon Cycle, and which I read as a teenager and had an enormous impact on my personal faith and my personal worldview. And that entire time, since the time I was 20 years old, I've wanted to develop them into a feature film. I remember when I first moved to L.A. and I was very poor. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anybody. 9/11 had just happened. I was very isolated and alone. And I sat in my apartment and wrote screen adaptations of Lawhead's novels. I didn't own the underlying rights. I didn't have any sort of option agreement. I didn't know what an option agreement was. I didn't know that there was such a thing as rights. I don't know what I thought, but I just took the books and wrote a screenplay out of them and have many times refined those works over the years. And Dallas Saulnier came to me 3 years ago and said, "Hey, if we could make anything, what would it be?" I said, "Well, I'd love to make Atlas Shrugged, and I'd love to make the Pendragon Cycle." And he came back a few weeks later. Dallas is like the Kool-Aid man. He bursts through walls and makes a mess everywhere he goes. And he came to me and said, "All right, I got you the rights to the Pendragon Cycle." I didn't even know he was doing that.
So the Pendragon Cycle is based on Arthurian legends and Merlin. I mean, how have you adapted it to kind of encode the religious or the traditional values that you're trying to get across?
Well, I think Lawhead did that in the underlying work, which is why the books really resonated with me when I was a young man. They sort of presented a different kind of Christianity than my American non-denominational evangelical background had given me the opportunity to experience. It was much more masculine. It was people whose faith had to exist in unwelcoming places. It was around the same time that Braveheart came out, when I was 16 or 17, that I read the books, which also had an enormous impact on me for the exact same reason. I often say that Braveheart's the most important Christian film of the last 30 years. I don't say Passion of the Christ. Passion of the Christ, beautiful work, important work, a passion play. Mel Gibson, I think really delivered something beautiful. But it's Braveheart that puts Christianity in the hands of real people. You want something
more muscular.
I want something, one doesn't look at the story of Christ and identify themselves in his suffering. He identified with us in our suffering. But we can't identify with Christ. Christ is like trying to identify with Superman. You're not Superman. You aren't perfect. You aren't the only begotten Son of the Father. You can't have any sort of fellowship with sinners and not be in sin. When the Bible says Christ was tempted in all ways as we are tempted, I don't actually think I don't think that Christ was tempted the way that you and I as individuals are tempted. I think he was tempted in the way that man was tempted in the garden. before sin entered the world. But you and I have never been tempted when not being in sin was one of the two options, right? If you have lust in your heart, you're an adulterer. If you have hate to your brother, you're a murderer. So it's not as though if you pal around with a prostitute, there may be a temptation to bad behavior, and you may even resist the temptation to bad behavior. But there's no possibility of no sin. And so your temptation and your individual temptation and Christ's temptation are quite distinct in that regard. I think if William Wallace was tempted by the prostitute, it's probably a whole lot more like your temptation. So, it was Christianity in the hands of actual men, of flawed, broken men in a hostile world, where faith would require something of you. And Lawhead's books did the exact same thing. It cast them in sub-Roman Britain against the backdrop of the most popular myth in the Western canon, the Arthurian legend. But that's really what drew me to the stories. And the Pendragon Cycle, Rise of the Merlin is the name of our series. It's an adaptive work, of course. You can't. Part of the beauty of a novel is that almost all of a novel takes place in the inner life of the characters, because the author tells us what they're thinking and tells us what they're feeling. All of it, even the parts that aren't the inner life of the character, all of it become a part of our inner life because we picture and imagine all of the scenarios. Yeah. And so it's simply not possible on any level to render a novel into a film, because I can't show in a film the inner life of the character. You can't hear their inner thoughts and feelings as you watch. And the very second that I represent something visually, I've presented it different than the way you saw it in your mind's eye when you read it. And so when people are, well, the movie's not as good as the book, well, it's not possible. The filmmaker couldn't have possibly satisfied your imagination when you read the book. But we did, in our adaptive work, endeavor to preserve what we believe was the heart of Lawhead's work, which is the Christian theme that he presented, which is not saccharine nor pandering in any way, which isn't idealized. Well, that's not fair. It's idealized, but it's not idealistic.
Yeah.
And he gave us great material to work with in that regard.
So you've described yourself as a man of faith. I wanted to dig into this a bit more. Has faith always been there for you? Is it something that's changed over time? Is it something that was inspiring you in the first place to create the Daily Wire?
Yes, to all of the above.
Yeah.
I had the advantage growing up in a largely Christian culture in rural West Texas of being exposed to the religion very early in life. And I suppose coming to faith very early in life, although what does that mean? I don't know. When you become a believer as a child, what is it that you believe? And what is it that you believe compared to what?
Yeah.
I mean, certainly there's something very innocent and honest and true about a child's faith. But I think it's a bit of a mystery too, right? As we work out our salvation over the course of a lifetime. So has my faith always been a part of my journey? Yes. Has it always informed my worldview? Yes. Has it always won the day? Certainly not. But has it always informed my worldview? Yes. Has it changed? Absolutely. I spent 15 years in L.A. as a lay minister. I had a home church at the time we were young Hollywood, We're not so, none of us are so young now. But, it was populated by people in their early and mid-20s at that time who, like me, were trying to navigate the city trying to kill us and figure out who we were and what we believed. And we would come together for an hour or so every week, and I led a very expository Bible study for those 15 years. Officiated the weddings of most of my friends, counseled them into marriage, and sadly on occasion counseled them at the ends of their marriage, and performed all the tasks for which a minister, all the tasks common to a minister of the gospel. And an interesting question is, do I believe now the things that I believed in those days? And the answer is yes and no. Certainly, I believe the core things have not changed. But my view of the church, or my view of the role of the church in the world, or my view of some of the more mysterious parts of the faith, I think have probably evolved and changed with time. I don't want to say evolved in the sense that it means got better. It's more like random selection. Like, I may be more wrong now than I was then, for all I know. But certainly, as we live and have contact with reality, those things should challenge our assumptions and have some impact on the way that we see our faith.
Yeah, I wonder how you see the role of Christians within politics, because I suppose looking across the pond from the UK, we see a sort of, on the one hand, the separation of church and state, which we don't have here with our constitutional monarchy, and yet America seems to be a much more religious place than the UK.
Yes.
Is it the role of the Christian to sort of try to impose or mandate a kind of Christian politics, a kind of Christian morality through politics, and use the channels of influence from politics to influence society in that way? Is that what's going on behind some of your work?
We discussed earlier the idea that we are fish in water and we live in our time, and our culture determines, maybe not determines our values, but sort of determines the range in which our values might operate, right? And I think that the role of the Christian politically is one of those issues that exists within a context. In America, conservatives in America like to say, make America a Christian nation again. But America was never actually a Christian nation. It was a nation of Christians, certainly. Sure. But
I've got a Jefferson's Bible. It's not very Christian.
It's not very Christian. But America was populated by Christians, informed by Christianity. But you're a Christian nation. The irony is, of course, that your God-appointed king, I'm not sure, believes in God. And certainly doesn't seem to believe in the Christian God. I think his mother probably did. And so what does it mean to be a Christian nation if the head of your church and the monarch of your country is at a minimum skeptical about the faith? I don't know. I know that being a Christian, the role of the Christian in this country is distinct probably from the role of the Christian in my country, related but distinct. If you're a Christian and you're a king, for example, in the sort of pre-Runnymede sense of the term, does the king have an obligation to have his rule be informed by his Christian values? Of course he does. Do the people have an obligation to live consistent with their Christian values? Of course they do, but they don't have much opportunity to participate in government in that setting. Our setting is much different. We now have Republican lowercase r and Democratic lowercase d systems of government. And if we're to believe Paul when he tells us that God appoints the rulers, well, we're the rulers. We select the people who are going to represent us in government, and therefore all the things that Paul says are the responsibility of government are now the responsibility of us as democratic citizens in a representative government. And so, yes, I think you very much have an obligation to have your politics be informed by your faith. I don't think that is, the term Christian nationalism, like every other sort of scare quotes term today, means whatever the user intends for it to mean. I think a lot of people wield the term Christian nationalism as a cudgel against Christians, and I think a lot of people wield the term Christian nationalism as a cudgel against non-Christians. So I don't want to get too hung up on what that term means or doesn't mean. But certainly it is our job as those ultimately selecting the government to make sure that we're selecting a government that represents our values.
I've heard that King Charles is actually really attracted to Eastern Orthodoxy and spends a lot of time at Mount Athos, but unfortunately he can't convert because he's the head of the Church of
The
England.
head of the Church of England. Yeah.
Which is a bit awkward. But I mean, thinking about your
Yeah.
president, do you think that Trump has changed American Christianity? Or do you think that maybe American Christianity has in some ways changed Donald Trump?
Yes and yes. Every president is both a cause and an effect. Right. Donald Trump, in his initial ascendancy, I think revealed something that was broken about American evangelicalism. And American evangelicalism has, I think, bettered Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, I think, very famously at Charlie Kirk's funeral after Erica Kirk made her sort of beautiful remarks forgiving the assassin. Donald Trump said, I don't forgive him, basically, right?
Yeah.
Like, I actually thought, a lot of people said it was sort of a classless remark by Donald Trump, and I didn't think so. I actually think that it's sort of Trump at his most charming, his most endearing, because it's incredibly honest.
Yeah.
He was in the only way that Donald Trump will ever allow himself. He was acknowledging that Erica Kirk is morally better than he is, that she represents a better set of virtues than he does, at least in this regard. Donald Trump's never going to say someone's better than him at anything. Donald Trump's 220 pounds. I don't think he would admit that, like Michael Phelps is a better swimmer than he is. It's not in his nature. But that was him in his own sort of endearing and self-deprecating way, acknowledging something beautiful about Erica's values that he doesn't share. And so I think just that acknowledgement in the way that he made it is evidence that American Christians have had some impact on him, caused him to see himself and the world differently than perhaps he would have seen them before that. How could anyone not be affected and impacted by that statement by Erica on that day?
But he almost looked at that statement and just took the completely opposite direction.
No, I don't think that's right. I think he always took the completely opposite direction. He didn't reject Erica's statement. He acknowledged that he isn't the man who could have made Erica's statement. And also, I would go one step further and say, appropriately, Erica Kirk's job as a Christian and the wife of Charlie Kirk is to embrace the virtue of Christ and forgiveness. Is to allow the Spirit of Christ in her to produce the fruit of forgiveness. I don't know that I forgive the guy yet. So an incredibly powerful thing for Erica to have said, and whether it was true or aspirational, it's powerful nevertheless. Donald Trump's job isn't to forgive the guy. Donald Trump is the elected leader of a country which demands of him justice. The role of the leader is to punish murderers in our society, not to forgive them.
I suppose it depends on your definition of forgiveness. That we are all called to forgive, and you can still execute, appropriate justice. But I watched the memorial.
I don't think Donald Trump probably is aware of such nuances.
When I watched the memorial, I found it quite frightening because I think one of the speakers says this is exactly what Charlie Kirk would have wanted. It's the sort of mixture between a worship service and a MAGA rally. And I think one of the dangers I see in that is that Christianity then becomes the kind of spiritual wing of conservatism. That you can have, a blatant remark like, I will not forgive this person, applauded, moments before singing whatever the contemporary Christian worship song is. Do you think that's a danger with Christianity, that it's going to just become this kind of spiritual wing of conservatism?
Well, I think that Christianity has always been, at every time and in every place where Christianity has been ascendant, used by governments and political movements as a sort of tribal rallying point. You know, I mean, the history of the monarchy in this country is a case study in that. You see, whether it's Cromwell, you know, smashing all the stained glass out of the country, the most beautiful churches in the history of the world, or it's Henry VIII stealing all the wealth of the abbeys and the Roman Catholic Church, and all the way down to the sort of church peculiars and the idea that not only did Henry VIII take Christianity away from Rome and make himself the head of the Church of England, but he also reserved certain churches not to even really be under the authority of the Church of England, but to be under his direct authority. Like, of course, you see in all of that Christianity being used as a tool, and you know, the Reformation was obviously bloody and protracted in this country and in Europe broadly. America was founded largely by Christians fleeing persecution on this side of the Atlantic. And so in all of those times and all of those places, you see Christian movements or Christianity being used as a sort of rallying point for political movements. So I don't think that it's anything new to say that that's a risk. I think, though, that if there was something frightening to you about watching Charlie's rally, I think that part of it is aesthetic. I think that part of it is that American evangelicalism doesn't look as reserved and beautiful as and traditional, perhaps, as British Anglicanism might. But I don't know that it's actually distinct in practice. I think that Charlie's memorial, from my point of view, where those aesthetics are normal to me, was quite beautiful and was something quite rare, not just in American politics and culture, but modern politics and culture, which was an open celebration of the life of a man specifically in regards to his faith. And, you know, what a peculiar thing it is for that to be rare. So I see in Charlie's, you know, are there the seeds of something to be worried about? There's always the seeds of something to be worried about. But I think that on the whole, Charlie's memorial was a truly beautiful moment in American politics. And yes, replete with all kinds of, the grift industrial complex was on display in some people's remarks. The people who want to wield Christianity for power, of course, were drawn to the most Christian and most public event, you know, maybe of the century, certainly of the last generation. So all of that's present in it. But you know what isn't great politics? Forgiving your husband's murderer. That's great Christianity.
I wonder, how do you, speaking about sort of American evangelicalism and the state of American evangelicalism, how would you distinguish a kind of healthy Christian conviction in politics from Christianity just being used as a tribal marker, acknowledging that there are dangers now, as there have always been?
Yeah. Well, there are things happening in American Christianity that are much more frightening to me than any of the things we've discussed so far, and that's the sort of Christ is King, largely trad Catholic movement among illiberal young white men in the country right now. Not all young white men, not all young white men, certainly not all Christian young white men, but a certain set that's highly illiberal. And they wield Christ as King not to put the emphasis on Christ, but to exclude the people who they blame for most of the ills in our society, which is the Jews.
Yeah,
they are open about the fact that this is what they do. They'll pull this clip and say, Jeremy still says it's wrong to say Christ is King. I've never said that it's wrong to say Christ is King. Christ is King. But don't howl at me for pointing out something that you yourself admit to doing, which is using this expression chiefly because Jews can't say it as a tribal rallying point. That's wielding Christianity in contravention of the gospel. You know, Christ is King because the gospel is true, Christ is King. Or because Christ is King, the gospel is true. Both of those statements are actually accurate. But, you know, to use the term in contravention of the gospel, to use it to express tribalism and division instead of the unity that we can have in Christ, to use it to exclude instead of to invite, I think is, taking the Lord's name in vain, and is an actually genuinely frightening thing. I think a lot of these young men have accurately assessed that we have huge problems in the West. They have been the victims of many of those problems in ways that I think we're all sort of frogs in the pot, as the heat was turned up, and we take for granted that we've paid very little price for these sins, and young people have paid a very high price for some of these sins. The Barack Obama years weren't that long ago for us, and they were an eternity ago for these guys. They've only grown up in that sort of post-Christian, post-Black Lives Matters, in some ways post-COVID-19 global shutdown nonsense moment, and they've been truly done wrong. And they rightly are drawn to tradition. They rightly are drawn to the idea that it isn't wrong to have a team, that it isn't wrong to have a tribe. They wrongly blame, in many cases, Jews for their problems, and they are wrongly wielding the gospel. But the gospel wields you back. A lot of people have used the Christian faith for personal gain, only to look up and believe in Christ. We tend to believe the things that we say if we say them long enough. And similarly, I think a lot of people seek to wield evil for their own gain, and find that evil isn't a tool wielded by man; man is a tool wielded by evil. So in both ways, I think there's both room for concern and room for hope. When people are slinging about the name of Christ, turns out there's actually power in the name of Christ.
Yeah, I'd love to talk in just a moment about the crisis of meaning, the crisis of masculinity, and maybe also hope. But first, we do need to take another quick break. If you're watching us on YouTube, please make sure you like and subscribe. We'll see you in just a moment.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations.
The ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something Christians share with Jews. It gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates.
Jeremy, are we living through a crisis of values or a crisis of beliefs, do you think?
Yes. My answer to every question so far has been yes. I'm not the most interesting guest. Because of course, the two things don't live in isolation. At the end of the day, all crises are crises of identity. Christianity ultimately is the heart of the West. There is no West apart from Christianity, although the West predates Christianity. But the West predates Christianity and then becomes Christianity, right? Becomes overwhelmed by Christianity. And the West can't really exist now as a philosophical and intellectual reality apart from Christianity. You could you could build the vessel empty, but once the vessel's been filled, you can't empty it again, right? And still have it be what it was. And so I think identity becomes the conversation that we should really be having. Who are we and why are we? And that's true both of our cultures and our countries and ultimately as individuals. You cannot solve the problem of our nations or of our culture without solving the problem of us as individuals first. The thing about representative democracies is they actually do represent us. Right now, everyone wants to blame the elites. Ultimately, that leads to a kind of anti-Semitism because for some reason we've decided that 0.2% of the world's population who wear funny hats control every country and every bank and every. I say if they do, power to them. If you could figure out a way to get 15 million people without even a centralized religious authority to actually run the 7 billion rest of us, then they should. But of course, that's nonsense. There is no tiny organized Illuminati running everything. If there were, things might actually work. The real truth is we don't like our culture because we don't like ourselves. People who are, this huge movement, I think, in Britain and America, to ban pornography or heavily regulate pornography. And when you talk to people about it, particularly young people, they'll tell you that they hate us for foisting upon them pornography. There's a line in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, which, among other things, blames King George for foisting upon us slavery. And it's a very similar concept, right? Because George didn't make us buy slaves, right? In a way, that line is a cop-out. Now, should we regulate pornography? I'm not trying to argue that pornography should not be regulated. I'm only saying that in a way we're always looking for someone else to blame for our weaknesses and for our failures. And I think most conspiratorial thinking, which is so rampant in my country right now, most blaming of elites, all of it is looking for someone on whom we can place the failure of us as individuals to properly identify ourselves in light of what Christ has done for us in the world.
Do you think that there's a relationship between evangelicalism and conspiratorial thinking? I suppose like one of the sort of key tenets of any conspiracy is the idea that there is a sort of elite that is pulling the strings behind the scenes. And I suppose there's sort of variations of that in like the strong sense of in-group, out-group mentality in certain forms of Christianity, and a certain sense of, there is the devil and there is the world. Do you see those things as interlinked?
Well, they may be interlinked. Also worth noting that there are actual conspiracies. Every day there are true conspiracies. People conspire to do things. And we just lived through one of the most globally consequential conspiracies of all time with COVID-19. Not that COVID-19 didn't exist, but that the reaction of governments around the world, including this one, including mine, chose to use the occasion of COVID-19 to engage in the most radical social engineering experiment perhaps in all of human history. We literally unplugged the world and believed that in our hubris that could be consequence-free. Locked people in their homes for years in some cases and believed that could be done consequence-free. And so, there is a world and there is a devil and there is also, because man is fallen, because original sin, as we've been discussing, is actually sin, not one particular bad political idea or another, or bad economic idea or another. There's always going to be people who, because of those things which are bad and true, see, angels in the architecture everywhere and believe that everything is being orchestrated against them and believe that all of their failures belong to someone else. And we live in a moment where victimhood has become almost the coin of the realm. The only thing that you can be and be virtuous in our society today is a victim, which means seeing yourself as having no agency, seeing yourself as being completely powerless, which then, of course, predisposes you to believe every conspiracy, because if you have no agency and you have no power, then someone must. The reason the world is the way that it is isn't because of you, therefore it must be because of someone else. And I think that's incredibly dangerous thinking. I think that the idea that you have no agency ultimately means you have no need of the gospel. If you aren't responsible for your own failures, then there's no reason for Christ to exist, no reason for Christ to have gone to the cross. And I think that it's both cause and effect, but you can't talk about a post-Christian society and talk about a whole lot of people who don't believe that they need Christ.
So why do you think that the West is, or Christianity is so integral to the West? Because I suppose there are a couple of different metaphors that we could use to think about their relationship. We could say that, Christianity is like the foundation upon the West as we know it, at least, has been built. But then some other people would want to see, I think I heard Douglas Murray use this metaphor, Christianity is the kind of scaffolding. So it's given us the kind of, I suppose, fictions such as the idea that individuals have human dignity, by which we can sort of erect this edifice. And now we can sort of do away with the scaffolding and we can believe in each other's dignity and just get on with our lives, sort of free of the shackles of all of the other parts of religion that we don't actually like. Why is it the former for you rather than the latter?
Well, listen, I have a lot of admiration for Douglas Murray and a great deal of his work. But of course, that's a very secularist view of religion. That's a man trying to, a very intelligent man trying to reconcile the fact that Christianity seems indispensable to all of the systems that he prefers, while he does not prefer Christianity. And so in some,
I think he was saying the jury is still out on whether Christianity will prove to be the scaffolding or the foundation of the house. So I think he wasn't necessarily saying, it has to be the scaffolding. I think he's someone who would probably want to say that we should be returning to church and sing hymns like he did at school, even if he doesn't want to do so himself.
Okay, fair enough. But we should do those things because they're true. See, if they're not true, then it doesn't matter if they're useful. If civilization has to be premised on a lie in order to succeed, then now I actually become a radical and say, well, then why should civilization succeed? If civilization is only the product of our fantasies, then we should keep looking until we figure out what can be built on the things that aren't fantasies. Christianity as a useful tool for useful idiots is not. That's not an appealing argument to me. And nor do I think, because I do believe in truth, I don't actually believe that a civilization founded on a lie is going to be very successful. Now, every civilization is founded on things that are not wholly true, because we see through a glass dimly and we rarely perceive things fully as they are. But what does it mean to be a conservative? Well, it means fundamentally believing that one cannot cavalierly reject the wisdom of our forebears. Not that they were right about everything. They were wrong probably about, at least as much as we're wrong about. But there are lessons and truths which were perceived through, perceived by millions of people across thousands of years, and we do not lightly cast them aside. And so I don't know. I just feel like the idea that they accidentally built a great society out of a bunch of ideas that are not in any way connected to reality. I don't know. If that's the case, then I don't know why our fanciful ideas aren't also creating a good society. Why don't our bad ideas that aren't true also result in a good society?
Well, I want to ask you about some of those bad ideas, because I suppose, if we have this Christian vacuum now in the sort of increasingly post-Christian West, you've spoken about the lie of victimhood, that we have no agency. What are the other things that are filling and parodying Christianity in our society?
Well, it's not a novel answer, but obviously you have things like the Green Movement, which is popular all across the West, which is fundamentally a religious movement. The sky gods are mad if we don't make appropriate sacrifices to them. I mean, it's one of the more pagan religious movements I've seen in my lifetime, certainly. And it's premised on some things that are probably connected to truth. Obviously, a desire for the not to be poor stewards of the earth, but it very quickly becomes much, much more than that. And it has all of the sort of requirements of religion. It has, a sort of belief in unseen powers, and it has a priesthood, and it has penance that must be paid. You got to pay your carbon tax, and it has all the sort of trappings of ascetic religion. You have to deprive yourself of luxuries and deprive yourself of joy to demonstrate that you're worthy of the God, the invisible power in the sky forgiving us and bringing healing to the land. It even has the hubris of believing that the brown people wherever they live, who we all feel sorry for, shouldn't be held to any of these standards because they're not real people, which is one of the great evils, I think, of all of these sort of movements which purport to support poor people in the third world, but essentially rob them of all agency and treat them like they're the most racist ideas possible. That somehow they aren't fully human and can't be expected to do any good in their own way. Feminism is obviously a kind of religious movement. You literally have to sacrifice babies for the sky god to give you rain. If you want prosperity, kill your babies. If you want prosperity, destroy the home. If you want prosperity, destroy the entire idea of mothers and fathers, and destroy all the hierarchies of parent and child. These are all fundamentally religious movements, and people adhere to them with religious zealousy.
So I suppose a lot of people have started to talk about Christian nationalism again as a kind of response to these ills that you've identified. And you've said that sort of Christian nationalism is something that means, as it has as many definitions as there are users of the term. Are there forms of Christian nationalism that you approve of and forms that you disagree with, or do you find the term unhelpful as a whole?
I just find the term right now unhelpful on the whole. I believe that Christians should express themselves with their vote. I believe that Christians should express themselves and their values and their priorities as members of democratic societies, as we've discussed. I think the idea of rejecting the liberal world order and doing away with democratic systems and ascending sort of virtuous strong men is to squander the great legacy of our forefathers, and I'm not interested in that, whether it bears the name Christian nationalism or doesn't bear the name Christian nationalism. But I want to go back briefly to that last question, because I think there's an interesting point that I was beginning to see emerge, which is, if you take the Green New Deal, green religiosity, or feminism, and the ascendancy of women and the destruction, the ascendancy of women into spaces traditionally held by men, and the sacrificing of babies to accomplish that, the sacrifice of marriage in order to accomplish that. If you go further into the sort of DEI, anti-white racial movements that exist in many countries in the West, including this one and including my own, the unchecked immigration movements, which take on, are still widely unpopular by both left and right, very popular among the governing elite, and I think more and more begin to bear religious language around them. I think in every one of these instances, and probably others that we haven't touched on, there is an attempt by sort of utopianist political philosophies to bring about the promises of God in Christ apart from Christ.
I mean, the Antichrist literally means in Greek instead of Christ.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's, in Christ there is neither male nor female. In Christ there is neither slave nor free. In Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. In Christ, the world will be made one, and the sort of Edenic state, the garden state, will be restored in the new heaven and the new earth. So you can see how all of these pseudo-religious secularist movements actually do reflect some part of the promises of God in Christ. We're going to make the world clean and pure again. We're going to remove any racial, tribal, or national divide. We're going to be one global people. We are the world. There are not going to be men and women in hierarchical relationship with one another. All that's true. Those are things that were promised in Christ. But if you try to accomplish the work of Christ apart from Christ, you are engaged in an act of evil, because Christ isn't the promises. Christ is the promise.
Yeah. So is it the failing then of the church that people have looked to alternative ideologies as a sort of way to get those promises of Christ, as you call them?
Yes. And it's the failure of the church, and it's the failure of Christians. So when I say the failure of the church, both on an institutional level, of course that's true. Church attendance has plummeted. The credibility of the church has been decimated by, in many cases, the actions of the church, or the churches. I mean, there's not, but also the church in the more universal sense, the non-institutional church, the called out ones, the chosen of God. We've allowed ourselves to get swept up by notions in that window created by culture that have caused us to fail in our responsibility, both as believers active in our own lives, as believers active in culture, as believers active in government. And so we've allowed other forces to move in and fill that vacuum.
But it feels like it's this kind of self-perpetuating cycle now, where now that there are these other ideologies, which, as you've spelled out, are taking a kind of religious form, that now Christians, or at least many conservative Christians, are pushing back even further against them. Climate change is not a problem. There isn't a problem between the relationship between men and women and so on. Is that a problem that you see happening in the church?
Well, yes, for all the same reasons we've discussed, right? It's much easier to become insular, become more tribal. It's funny when my business partner is traveling with me on this trip, and we rode in from Heathrow in a taxi, and the driver kind of picked up on a little bit of what we were talking about in the back and started sharing some of his political ideas with us. And one of the things that he said, among other things, was, I just want 100 acres somewhere. I should just move to America where you can still get 100 acres. And I want to put a house right in the middle of the 100 acres and never see no one, not be bothered by nobody, and not be bothered by anybody. I thought, what a perfect summation of the worst impulse of conservatives. There is something in the heart of the conservative philosophy which in difficult times makes us want to retreat into ourselves and to be left alone by the world, to go be on our farm and be left alone. But that's not actually what we're called to be in the world. I mean, from our time in the garden to now, we've been called to participate in the creative act. We've been called upon by God to name the animals, to tend the garden. And I think that we have to resist, as a kind of almost innately conservative expression of sin, is retreat and isolation. And we have to see that in ourselves for what it is and reject it.
And yet the other stance is to take the battle stance, and that also feels extremely exhausting to a lot of people. I know a lot of people who are just saying, I don't use media anymore, I'm not checking the news because I just want to get away from that, and it's sort of overwhelming. So I suppose
all things in moderation.
Yeah.
You don't get to just walk away and then be surprised that the outcome isn't the one that we had hoped for. And yes, we're inundated by a constant dopamine-fueled, clickbait, rage bait, to use your term, fueled 24/7 ubiquitous news cycle that will drown you if you try to live in it full time. But don't create a false binary out of those two ideas. It is not necessarily true that one must be in the deep end of the pool in order to be wet.
Yeah. And not always thinking either that there is always going to be a political solution. It feels like there is a kind of tension running throughout this conversation, which is that on the one hand, you're saying it's important to some extent to engage in the culture wars. On the other, these problems are not surface level problems. They are problems of the human condition. Is that a tension you feel in your work?
Oh yeah, well, to come all the way back to the power of culture, I believe it was the movie Braveheart that told us we don't have to beat them, we just have to fight them. Our job is to live according to our lights, to stand for the things that we believe in, to be animated by the truth of the gospel. Our job isn't to win, because God doesn't recommend us; He recommends Himself.
And maybe you've already given me an answer to this, but for those people who are frightened about the future, for Christians, and maybe even angry about the future, what would you say to them? What gives you hope?
Well, listen. In an ultimate sense, our only hope is in Christ's work and salvation. I mean, there's absolutely no guarantee that we're going to win these political battles. There's no guarantee that we're going to win these cultural battles. One doesn't have to look very far through history to see, what life was like in the terror of the Soviet Union, or the camps in Nazi Germany, or China and North Korea today. Many parts of China and all of North Korea today. People have lived in horrible situations, and we may find ourselves living in horrible situations. So our hope is ultimately only in Christ. But I don't think it's hopeless for our societies either. It is absolutely hopeless for our societies if we abandon hope and retreat to our 100 acres and don't turn on the news and don't engage with culture and just wait for the day where the jackbooted thugs knock on the door and feed us to lions somewhere. Well, of course, that is what's going to happen. And so, I think it's a mistake to put our hope in our efforts. But I think that it is, of course, hopeless if we abandon effort altogether.
Jeremy Boring, this has been such a fascinating discussion on the state of the West. Thank you so much for joining us on Unbelievable.
Thank you.